Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're jumping straight into a bit of a biblical mystery. We're going to be taking a close look at a recent review from the Open Volume, which is a really solid theology journal, covering Jonathan McGill's study guide, The Living Text Jude. And honestly, what this review reveals about how we read, or how we actively avoid certain parts of the Bible, is just absolutely fascinating. So think about this for a second. What would you say is the absolute most neglected letter in the New Testament? Well, according to the review, it's Jude. Modern readers, and yeah, even a lot of pastors, tend to just ignore it or actively avoid preaching on it. But why? Well, it's mostly because it is packed to the brim with some really weird, cosmologically strange content. We're talking fallen angels, divine counsels, ancient prophecies, the whole shebang. It's definitely an uncomfortable text for anyone with a super domesticated, tidy worldview, so it usually just gets left sitting on the shelf. Enter Jonathan McGill. Now, what's really compelling here is that McGill is actually a lay theologian, but he's got over 20 years of hands-on ministry experience. So this isn't some dry, dusty academic commentary. The reviewer points out that it's a highly practical guide, explicitly built to recover that massive cosmic scope of Jude for serious students and everyday readers alike. McGill is basically trying to prove that Jude isn't just a museum piece to look at through glass. It's a living, breathing word. Okay, so how does he do it? Well, McGill's whole approach hinges on this brilliant structural key. It all comes down to a single Greek verb, tēreō, which means to keep or to preserve. The reviewer actually praises McGill specifically for uncovering this, because tēreō acts as the architectural spine of the entire letter. It essentially builds a whole theology of perseverance right into the vocabulary of the text itself. And it's really cool to watch how this builds. McGill tracks tēreō through 5 distinct appearances in Jude. First, in verse 1, you have believers who are kept for Jesus. Then, in verse 6, the fallen watchers are kept in chains. Jump to verse 13, and total darkness is kept for the wandering stars. Then there's the call in verse 21 for the community to keep itself. And finally, the whole thing resolves beautifully in verse 24 with praise to the God who is able to keep us from stumbling. The review highlights this as just a really brilliant, illuminating word study that perfectly balances divine keeping with human faithfulness. Section 1. Anatomy of Cosmic Corruption. Having set up that structural spine, the review then dives into how McGill handles Jude's most heavily debated, cosmologically charged material. And McGill makes a crucial observation here. There's a major shift between chapters 2 and 3. The letter moves away from just warning against false teachers who merely commit personal sins and pivots to targeting corruptors, people who are actively leading others into sin. It's really a detailed anatomy of harm coming from the inside. McGill breaks down this specific taxonomy of harm using a triad of Old Testament figures. First up is Cain, who represents theological arguments that basically dismantle personal accountability. Next is Balaam, who stands in for the mercenary use of spiritual authority, doing it just for personal gain. And third, you have Korah, representing organized schism or rebellion against legitimate authority. The reviewer points out that this is an immensely useful framework for spotting real-world harm in our own communities today. And listen, McGill does not shy away from the hard stuff, specifically the weirdness of Genesis 6. In Appendix B of the book, he provides a really comprehensive defense of the divine being's view. That's the ancient idea that the sons of God mentioned there were actually angelic beings. He argues that the alternative Sethite view, which is pretty popular today, actually only emerged centuries later, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, simply to avoid the embarrassment of that older, much stranger interpretation. Right. So then there is the elephant in the room, Jude's use of non-biblical apocryphal sources like 1 Enoch and the Assumption of Moses. As the review explains, this caused a lot of historical embarrassment for the church. Jude was accepted early on as canon, for sure, but its casual use of these strange, external texts made a lot of later readers incredibly uncomfortable. But this is where McGill's approach is so sharp. He argues that simply using a text is not the same as endorsing it as scripture. The reviewer absolutely loves this distinction. They note that framing Jude's use of something like 1 Enoch this way shows it wasn't some sort of theological slip-up, but rather a highly calculated act of pastoral intelligence, perfectly tailored to connect with his ancient audience. Now, the review also highlights a pretty bold exegetical commitment McGill makes regarding Sodom in verse 7. Following scholar Richard Balcom, McGill interprets the phrase other flesh as referring to boundary-crossing angelic flesh, which parallels the fallen watchers, rather than the dominant evangelical interpretation, which usually links it to same-sex desire. It's definitely a departure from popular views, but the review notes he argues it confidently based on the textual parallels. Section 2. Denominational Perspectives and Reactions. Because McGill writes from a very explicit Wesleyan-Arminian theological framework, the reviewer takes some time to analyze how different Christian traditions might react to his work. For instance, Reformed readers will likely push back on his logic regarding verse 5, disagreeing with the idea that genuinely saved people can face destruction. Catholics, on the other hand, might really appreciate how his view of 1 Enoch aligns with their Dei Verbum framework. Lutherans might notice a missing law-gospel distinction, while Orthodox readers are probably going to resonate strongly with his focus on theosis or participatory salvation. And Baptists? Well, they'll highly value his rock-solid defense of Jude's canonicity. Bringing it all back down to earth, McGill looks at Jude's specific pastoral response to danger in verses 22 and 23. He breaks it down into a highly practical threefold approach: having mercy for the wavering, executing urgent rescues for those who are near the fire, and showing cautious mercy, mercy with fear, for those who are deeply compromised. It's a fantastic refusal of our modern tendency to either apply a blanket response to everyone or to just throw our hands up and withdraw entirely. Section 3. The final review verdict. So after analyzing all the intense cosmology and the pastoral application, what is the reviewer's verdict on the ultimate utility of this book for pastors and serious students? Well, the high points are substantial. The reviewer really loved the tēreō structural analysis, the scholarly appendices diving into Enoch and Genesis 6, the insightful taxonomy of correctors, and those highly specific pastoral applications that totally avoid generic platitudes. But to be fair, there are some drawbacks. The reviewer noted that the biggest flaw is a somewhat mechanical, rigid 6-theme framework that McGill applies to the end of every single chapter, which can feel a bit formulaic. They also pointed out occasional tonal inconsistencies, like suddenly jumping between warm pastoral advice and super heavy commentary, plus a glossary at the back that mostly just repeats text from the chapters. Ultimately, though, the reviewer's final verdict is recommended. They held back from saying highly recommended purely because of that repetitive structural flaw. But, and this is key, they explicitly state that McGill's lack of formal seminary credentials is completely irrelevant to his exegetical success here. The book achieves exactly what it sets out to do. It equips people to engage a really difficult, obscure text with absolute confidence. So what does this all mean for us? Well, we are left with a pretty provocative thought. McGill's study guide basically proves that the very strangeness we tend to avoid in the letter of Jude, the cosmic scope, the fallen angels, the really intense spiritual stakes, is precisely what makes it so profoundly relevant for today's church. It really makes you wonder, if we've been ignoring Jude to our own detriment, what other neglected, obscure texts are just sitting on our shelves, holding the exact answers we need right now? Keep exploring, keep questioning, and honestly, never be afraid to dive into the strange parts of the text.